Good morning, everyone. It's 11:01 Central Time and 12:01 Eastern, and good morning or good afternoon. And thank you for joining our webinar series named Ready, Set, Relief. And I'm really excited not only about this specific webinar, but the fact that this is almost like a continuation of our COVID convo that we had started. We've done 15 of those seminars, specifically as we went through the pandemic and the challenges for school districts to open up. And I do want to take this opportunity actually to thank a few people that were heavily involved in that, specifically Andy Almos, the superintendent at East Central Schools, Dan Voce, the superintendent at Mora, and Tim Lutz at Bemidji Schools. They were heavily involved in helping us put that program together and really, I think, help a lot of school districts kind of manage the challenge of, hybrid, in-school, online type of education. So again, thank you very much for helping us through the process. So if we go to the next slide, we have a number of things we want to cover today. So we'll run through a lot of this stuff. As you know, with the stimulus package, we're just going through the process of fully understanding exactly what it is, how it's going to flow through, and how the funding will work. So we've kind of pulled together a lot of experts in this area from Washington, D.C., from our local regions to kind of help us through this maze. So I'm really excited that we got some real good experts here that'll help us through the process. I do want to give you a little overview of the market trends that we're seeing that are going to impact all of you, and then we'll jump right into the actual rescue plan itself and some of the pretty significant challenges, I think, as it relates to the K-12 funding itself. Because even if you're getting those dollars, how you use them, when you use them, what's the process, and how you communicate with the public is going to be critical. And we'll give you some examples. We've done some calculations in terms of what we understand how the funding will flow and how individual school districts will get those dollars. And we'll end with a quick summary of the most recent report card that came out from the American Society of Civil Engineers that really talked about some of the infrastructure needs that a lot of our school districts have. So a lot of things to cover, but we're excited that you could join us. So just to introduce myself, Arif Qureshi, I'm the president of Building Systems Holdings. We're a holding company that has a number of other firms underneath us. Most of you probably work with one or all of them. ICS, Obernell, and CPMI, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. I do want to take this opportunity and I want to pass it on to some of our other panelists here so they can give you a little background about themselves. So I'll start off with Blake, if you can take the mic and give us a little background about yourself.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Arif, and thanks everyone for joining this morning. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. My name is Blake Androff. I'm an executive vice president at the Signal Group. We're a bipartisan public affairs firm located in Washington, D.C. By way of background, I spent the last 15 years in federal service in a variety of different roles. I led communications for 2 congressional committees, including the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. I led communications for 2 cabinet secretaries during the Obama-Biden administration. And then I spent the last 2 years in House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's office working on some of the long-term message strategy, as well as the $1 trillion infrastructure package that Congress will soon consider. At Signal, I consult for both government relations clients as well as public relations clients. And I would just end on a personal note. I was born and raised in New Hope, Minnesota, so my family still lives in the Twin Cities, and I try to get back as often as I can to visit the family cabin just outside of Brainerd. So particularly excited to be here talking about the great work happening in Minnesota.
Great. Thanks a lot, Blake. And then Sam, if you're on.
All right. Thank you, Arif. Good to be here today. And I'm Sam Walseth. For those of you from rural education, know me with my MREA work. But I do a lot of state legislative work on behalf of the service cooperatives, a little bit of work for ICS, rural education, among other issues. Happy to be here today to learn more about the important work the feds are doing and offer comments here and there about any questions or thoughts about state legislative activity as we're currently in our state legislative session.
Great. Thanks, Sam. And Todd?
Thanks, Arif. I'm Todd Rapp from Rapp Strategies. We're a strategic communications firm, and one of the largest segments we work in is education right now. We are a partner of ICS on the many building projects that they work on around the upper Midwest. We're also a partner with 6 of the regional service cooperatives to provide support for school districts on operating levy efforts. And in addition to that, we also work directly with school districts sometimes in more complex problem solving and communications challenges. Thanks for having me here.
Great, Todd. Thanks a lot. Let's go to the next slide. So just a quick 1-second overview of Building Systems Holding. We're about 220 individuals that are really focused in the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic region. We do have 13 regional locations, and we have a group of specialists that really focus on helping the public sector, not only in terms of the infrastructure, but really on the funding side. We're heavily involved in supporting the funding aspects that are needed to ensure that you have the dollars you need to continue to improve your infrastructure, along with bringing financing to the table through a public-private partnership program. So a lot of exposure in this area and a lot of expertise in some of these public sector issues that all of you are dealing with. And just to give you a quick, ICS and Obernell and CPMI were the three companies that make up Building System Holdings. ICS is really focused on providing life cycle solutions for public sector. Obernell is our engineering group that provides a lot of engineering support all the way, not only K-12, but heavily into the healthcare market and into the university market. And CPMI is really around project estimating and cost control on construction projects. So that's kind of the whole group that makes up Building System Holdings. Let's talk a little bit about the 2021 education trends. I thought it was important that we kind of set the stage here with a recent survey that was done by Morris Leatherman and Rap Strategies. There's some key takeaways from this, and we wanted to talk to you a little bit about this in terms of the impact. Even though I think the survey was done in Minnesota, we're looking at an opportunity to expand this to a number of the other regions that we work in. What you will find is that it was something that I think we all thought is how the public is feeling, but having some data and information is very, very valuable. I'll summarize a few things, because when we kind of looked at it and saw currently 54% of the responses want the schools to open fully now, today, right? So there's a very large majority that expect that as you as leaders are going to open up the school districts and bring the kids back in. And 39% want schools open in a hybrid mode. So you have a very large percentage that really wants in school. And I think you'll hear more from Todd about the survey and the specifics around that. But the other important thing we can't forget is that there are about 7% of the population that was surveyed feels that they would rather have full online type of education. I think that there's a shift happening here. There's a paradigm shift, but there's a shift in terms of how education will be delivered as we move forward. And I think that has a direct impact in terms of, the technologies, the issues that you all ran into in terms of training the teachers on how to really educate kids through an online program. And when we did some analysis on, what did people feel in terms of how the administration performed, 51% rated that online learning was, good overall. So you're looking at 42% saying good, 9% excellent, and about 14% though felt that online type of education was really poor. And there were two main reasons around it. Number one, of course, was technology. Number two was about the expertise on the educators being able to educate the kids through an online process. In terms of how they rated hybrid learning, it got about 57%. I think what's important to understand is that prior or pre-COVID, at least in the state of Minnesota, you had 87% rated the quality of education either good or excellent. What we know now is that has dropped by almost 20 percentage points. So there's a lot of concern among the public in terms of whether school districts are really set up to be able to educate kids in a complete different manner. And as I mentioned before, there's still a large minority, let's call it, that expects some form of online type of education to continue. So the important piece of this is, how do we do this, and how do we leverage some of the funds that are available to make improvements? The macro trends are also important. I think the Federal Reserve is going to make some announcement today at 2:30 Eastern time, but it's very interesting when you start looking at what's happening to the country as a whole. The most recent data we're getting from both Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley says that we're going to see a GDP growth in the US of almost 7%. I think Morgan Stanley feels it's over 7%. And for the first time since 1984, the US growth will rival China. I think that's a big deal when you start looking at the impact that will have at a micro level and all the way down into the school district. In addition to that, we're seeing unemployment rates predicted to fall below 5% by the end of 2021 and less than 4% in 2022. What that really means that we're going to have a significant stress put on organizations in terms of hiring people, in terms of doing projects, in terms of cost. And there's a lot of concern that inflation is kind of coming around the corner. So I think we need to understand not only the micro level issues that US school districts are dealing with, but there are some macro level issues that will impact you in terms of inflation, in terms of finding people. So as we understand that, I wanted Blake to give you all a high level overview and understand that a lot of things are changing, and he'll talk about that and how these funds flow is going to continue to change. But I think it's important to, again, set the foundation around what is this rescue plan? What are the key components of that? So with that, let me pass it on to Blake. Blake?
Great, thanks, Arif. Appreciate that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the American Rescue Plan. This is the most recent COVID relief package that Congress passed. It was just signed into law by President Biden last Thursday. Before we dive into the nuts and bolts, I'm going to apologize in advance. We're going to cover a whole bunch of numbers pretty quickly, so I'll try to do that as succinctly as possible. But I did want to provide a little bit of context around the political situation that's happening in DC as this unfolds, because I think it'll help inform kind of some of the rest of the conversation. In terms of the American Rescue Package itself, it is a massive $1.9 trillion package that's really meant to provide relief to the healthcare crisis and the economic crisis stemming from the COVID-19 global pandemic. This comes on the heels of the CARES Act and other COVID relief packages that Congress has previously passed. In terms of the timeline, the legislation was introduced in late February. It was passed by the House by the slimmest of majorities, with a vote of 219 to 212, very much on a party line vote. It passed the Senate a few days later, 50 to 49, again, very much on a party line vote, went back to the House, and then it was sent to the president and signed into law last Thursday. So this is all to say, just in terms of the political climate, it happened very quickly. It passed on a complete party line vote. Not a single Republican voted for it in the House or in the Senate. And so now what we're going to see is the president, the vice president, the first lady, and the second gentleman fanning out across the country as they are this week, really trying to sell it to different media markets to make sure that there's enough political support for it, because there's certainly public opinion support for it. I'm going to talk a little bit, if we go to the next slide, just about kind of some of the specific provisions in it. As I mentioned, the bill was largely meant to provide immediate relief for COVID-19. This was not meant to be an infrastructure package. Congress is considering that next, now that this has been signed into law. And so we can go into that a little bit later. But this was really meant to deal with the immediate crisis at hand. So some of the things that included that are of note: one, small business relief. It includes about $50 billion for small business. This breaks down to about $7 billion for the Paycheck Protection Program, which people may have seen in earlier iterations of COVID relief packages. $15 billion goes to the smallest of small businesses to stay afloat. Congress created a new restaurant revitalization fund for $28 billion. And there's also $10 billion in there for small business financing. This package also includes direct payments, as previous packages did as well. So in here is $1,400 in direct payments that are literally going out as we speak right now to families that are eligible, making less than $75,000 per individual and $150,000 per family. And the package also extends the federal unemployment insurance benefit bump of $300 per week until the end of September. If we go to the next slide, the aid to school and school districts, as well as childcare. A couple of things to note here. One, in terms of the provisions directly related to school and childcare, the legislation provides over $125 billion for K through 12 schools to reopen for in-person learning, address learning loss, and support students that are working to recover from the long-term impacts of the pandemic. Of that $125 billion, $123 billion, so the vast majority of it, is going to go to funding for the Elementary and Secondary School Education Relief Fund. States are required to subgrant 90% of those funds directly to school districts to support the implementation of public health protocols, as well as to safely reopen schools for in-person learning, addressing that learning loss, and then meeting students' long-term social and emotional needs. School districts are required to spend at least 20% of that funding, and states are required to spend at least 5% of that funding to implement evidence-based interventions to address learning loss. There's also a provision in there that requires states to spend at least 1% of that state level funds for evidence-based summer enrichment programs, as well as additional 1% of those state level funds for evidence-based comprehensive after-school programs. The ARP also includes $800 million dedicated to wraparound services for students experiencing homelessness and $3 billion in funding for programs that are authorized under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The next tranche here specifically has $2.75 billion for states to provide services to non-public schools that serve a significant percentage of students from low-income families. It includes both a maintenance of effort provision as well as a maintenance of equity provision to ensure that high poverty school districts and schools that do not shoulder a disproportionate amount of any of the state or local education cuts that happen. A third component of this is around colleges and universities. There's $39.6 billion for colleges and universities and their students. There is a requirement in the bill that at least 50% of the funding go to emergency financial aid grants directly to students to help with college costs and basic needs like food, housing, and healthcare. The other half is available to institutions of higher education to defray some of that lost revenue and increase costs from declining enrollment, transition to online learning, closures of revenue producing services and facilities, COVID testing, vaccinations, PPE, classroom retrofits, and the such. The last component that I would focus on here is around childcare provider assistance. This comes in at about $39 billion for childcare. That includes $24 billion for the childcare stabilization grants and about $15 billion for the childcare and development block grant programs. States must use the childcare stabilization funds to award subgrants to qualified childcare providers that are still open or are temporarily closed to help support their operations throughout the pandemic. And these subgrants can be used for expenses such as personnel, rent, mortgage, cleaning supplies, PPE, mental health services for children and health, or staff rather, other goods and services necessary to maintain or resume operations. The sub-grant recipients must certify that they abide by all state and local public health guidance. And then the child care and development block grant funds can be used flexibly by states, including for child care subsidies, and also give states the authority to expand eligibility for child care assistance to essential workers regardless of their income. The last thing on this before we go to the next slide is that the legislation also includes $1 billion for Head Start to ensure that Head Start has the resources they need to continue to provide services throughout the pandemic. In terms of tax, healthcare, and state aid, as folks may know on this call and have witnessed firsthand, COVID-19 recession really kind of brought to light some of the income inequality across the country. And so the bill also includes a variety of expansion of different programs that deal with anti-poverty tools that the US government has, namely the Earned Income Tax Credit, as well as the Child Tax Credit. So I'll touch on both briefly. The bill increases the amount of the child care tax credit from $2,000 to $3,000. It steps it up for children under 6 up to $3,600. It also makes the child care tax credit fully refundable. In terms of the Earned Income Tax Credit, it nearly triples the maximum amount for Earned Income Tax Credit for workers without children. On the healthcare side, the bill includes 5 different provisions related to improving healthcare coverage. I would say the biggest provisions are a 100% COBRA subsidy for anyone on COBRA for the next 6 months for folks who lost employment or had their hours reduced. It also includes about a $35 billion subsidy to help with premiums for those who are purchasing healthcare on the ACA exchange. The last component that's an equally important one here is around state and local government funding. The bill provides $360 billion for state and local aid, as well as for tribes and territories. We're going to discuss how that specifically breaks down for Minnesota, but at a national level, it means that state and local aid comes in at about $325 billion, tribes and territories a little above $24 billion, and then coronavirus capital projects about $10 billion. So this funding can go directly to the public health emergencies. State and locals can use this for negative economic impacts because of the pandemic, help small businesses, nonprofits, impacted industries. They can provide relief to essential workers through a premium pay, increasing that premium of up to $13 per hour. The legislation does not include a federal minimum wage hike to $15. That was an attempt. The Senate parliamentarian, which is kind of the referee on the rules, ultimately stripped it out because it wasn't germane to the bill. And it also can be used for investments in broadband, water, and sewer infrastructure. So I know we covered a ton, and we're going to break it down a little bit more what that means for Minnesota, but just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview at a national level of what that means.
Great. Thanks a lot, Blake. That was helpful, I think. A lot of data and information, but I think part of it, just so I make sure I let everybody know, is that we will continue these webinars on an ongoing basis, because the conversation I have with Blake and Todd and Sam too is that as this information gets cleaned up and we really truly understand the process of how the dollars will flow and how they end up in the state, and some of them may even be grants, we'll have some additional webinars going on that will really demonstrate, help you, I think, all of you figure out how you're able to get to those dollars and what the process is. But I think at the same time, I wanted to talk a little bit about, I think, some of the challenges we also see in terms of these dollars that they come in. So if we move to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the fact that even though, there's a lot of dollars flowing in, well, we've also noticed that there's some public perception challenges, right? When you look at a public sector, typically we've always had, it's always been underfunded. There's lack of funds, but at the same time, I think public perception is that, all these dollars are coming in. So why do we need additional dollars? And I think extremely important that people need to understand, the public needs to understand, and this is why I wanted Todd to really talk about how you communicate this to the public so they truly understand that, this is really about reopening schools. This is to take care of the immediate needs you have. It really doesn't address some of the massive shortfalls that school districts have been facing for the last decade or so. And then there's an issue with timing and planning, right? We don't have a full understanding of when these dollars will flow. How do you plan for that? It's going to be extremely critical. You want to make sure that you've got the right data pulled together. You understand exactly how much of those dollars are, and then really come up with a process in terms of, who is it in your organization that will be set up as a committee to look at it and determine, because some of these districts, as you know, excuse me, are getting significant dollars. So you want to understand exactly how you're going to fund those and what are the needs that really are the high priority. The other piece of this, it's a lot of it is one-time funding, right? It's great to get infused with a lot of capital, but you also have to be concerned that if you're spending those dollars in terms of increasing, teachers or increasing additional staff, what does that mean once that funding goes away and the cliff comes over and you don't have the dollars that you need to support on an ongoing basis? And then I think these decisions have to be made very, very carefully. When you start making these type of decisions, you have to not only understand the impact you can have on your budget currently, the impact on your future budget, but really the impact on the staff, the impact on your community as a whole. I think extremely important. So the reason we bring this up is this is the time to start planning and thinking through all of this. And we were able to kind of pull together some data calculations in terms of how all the school districts will be funded with this third round of funding that is coming through. So it's extremely important that you get that data, get that information. We'll let you know how to get that, because then you'll have at least a starting point to understand that here's the dollars I'm potentially getting. Let's start really planning around that and figure out what are the high priorities to be able to fund certain things. And as you know, a number of school districts are dealing with budget shortfall issues. And how do you end up using some of those dollars? Can you use some of those dollars for that budget shortfall or not? So these are all the things that we think that are some funding challenges, and we'll continue to have these ongoing webinars that'll dig into some of these issues as we start understanding what the process is in terms of how these funds will flow. Just a question to Blake, do you have any insight in terms of how this funding may flow at this point? Or are you still kind of wrestling with, what's the process that this is going to go through?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. Part of it is, folks don't really know. And the reality is that the way that the legislation was set up was to get money out the door as fast as possible. So what that typically means is it'll flow down to the states. It'll be up to the governor's office to set up a process internally to the state to dole that out to state, to county, to local, as well as school districts. The idea is to get it out as fast as possible. And so I think what you'll see is folks will try to get it from those, regional entities into the field as quickly as possible and try to get it down to the lowest possible lever. The reality is, because the legislation was just signed last Thursday, some of those decisions, some of those processes aren't in place yet. I'd imagine they will come to light over the coming weeks, and that's the kind of stuff that we definitely want to make sure that we provide resources to folks on the call in future sessions to make sure that they're aware of exactly what that looks like. But the reality is right now it's set up to go as fast as possible. That being said, there is a variety of different kind of levels through which it needs to flow. And each one of those kind of processes will come to light in the coming weeks.
Okay, sounds good, Blake. Thank you. And I think at the same time, I think you can start planning and getting your house in order as you move forward. Great. Next slide. So this is, I'll just run through these really fast, right? We're doing some analysis and saying, there's really some dollars in there that talks about what you can spend those dollars on. You can spend those dollars mainly through a process of, multiple approaches, but again, if it's a one-time expenditure, there's some value to that. So we looked at it in terms of infrastructure and said, look, if you were to put dollars into the infrastructure improvements that you need, and ventilation is a component of it, that they've said, look, you got to improve your ventilation systems. There's a return on that investment, right? Because when you upgrade systems, you get them to be more efficient, you can have ongoing operational savings. So think of it as, not only the fact that it's a one-time expenditure, but where can you invest those funds that you get a return on those investments on an ongoing basis. And I think the second example was just talking about the same, that we're also seeing about a 5 to 7% now, actually it's gone up in terms of escalation with construction costs. So the longer you wait to get some of these projects done, it's going to end up costing more and more. And I think the next slide talks really about some of the safety and security projects that we've been working on in a lot of school districts. And it's a great way to use part of that funding to hopefully improve some of that safety and security needs that most school districts currently have. Okay, next slide. Let's talk about the states where we work in and give you an idea in terms of how those dollars were calculated and are flowing through. So at this point, when you look at Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, Pennsylvania, and South Dakota. So with the state fiscal relief package that is coming in, Iowa is going to get about $1.6 billion, and this is where the state will decide how it will get spent. Minnesota is getting about $2.9 billion, North Dakota about 1.4, Pennsylvania is 7.4, and South Dakota is 1.3. When you start adding billions of dollars, then you really got something. And there's a massive amount of billions of dollars coming in into each of these states. There's also local fiscal relief, right? So there's relief right down to the city and county level, and that's going to be, Iowa has about over $1 billion, Minnesota $258 million and $291 million for North and South Dakota, and Pennsylvania at $5 billion. And then you go further down and start looking at how those dollars will flow into each of these states for K-12 school relief package. And you've got about $803 million coming into Iowa, about $1.373 billion into Minnesota, $314 million North Dakota, $5 billion in Pennsylvania, and $392 million in South Dakota. So again, these are significant dollars that will be divvied up, and we'll talk about how the calculations work. Will be divvied up using tier 1 formulas into each of these school districts, and you'll have an opportunity to really start planning around how you plan to use those dollars and spend those dollars, understanding that there's some risk depending on where you put those dollars. Okay. So we just did some calculations based on our understanding of how those dollars are to be distributed through the Title I formula. And really with districts with concentrated poverty are going to get a larger piece of the pie. There's a lot in terms of equity issues that we're dealing with, which is understandable with this administration. But if you start looking at, understanding how those calculations work, and most of you have gotten the first 2 rounds of funding, or it is actually flown through. We did a calculation for the third phase of funding that will be coming in as a part of this ARP. What we've done is kind of pull together the spreadsheets around that. Again, I'll let you know how you can pull that information and pull it all together. But these are just examples. We looked at, we kind of picked a large, mid-sized, smaller school districts. You look at Burnsville Public Schools, they got about 8,000 students. And then you're looking at their phase 3 funding at about 12.5 million. You combine all of the funding that they've received to date, you're looking at almost $19 million that's flowing into Burnsville. Staples Motley, again, a smaller school district, but about 1,000 students. Their phase 3 funding is going to be about 2.7 million. And this is, this is significant dollars that are actually coming in. And I think it's important that the right plan be pulled together in terms of how you want to spend those and where these dollars need to go. Rockford Public Schools, about 1.1, and then ISD 318, which is Grand Rapids, about 5.5. So we wanted to just give you guys just a quick overview. This is an estimation based on the way the legislation was written and based on the calculation on Title I. And I think, as Sam mentioned, majority of those dollars will flow into K-12 using that formula. Again, significant dollars that are coming in, and we do have data for all the school districts. Again, it's not exact science at this point. We'll get more details around it, but clearly it'll give you a general idea in terms of those dollars that are coming, because I do believe that once you have that data and information, you can really start planning in your school district exactly what you do with those dollars as you move forward. Okay. So, where we sit today, right? I mean, we sit today as, very recently we have the American Rescue Plan's been put in place, it's been signed, and now people are trying to figure out who gets what. The dollars are going to start flowing in. A lot is going to happen relatively soon, because the intent, as Blake mentioned, was to get those dollars into the hands of these institutions. And they want to get that as fast as possible. And I think the fact is that as you go into this fall, everybody wants schools fully open. So those dollars are going to flow in really soon, so you can start making those investments. And what do you need to do with your facilities? What do you need to do with your programs to make sure you're really ready to be able to leverage those dollars and do the right thing? The challenge, though, I still think, is how do you communicate that to the public? And who better than Todd to talk a little bit about communications and discuss, how should you handle this once a dollar comes in? Because it will be significant dollars. Todd, if you can take over from here.
Thanks, I will, Arif, and apologize to everybody. I'm going to go on stop video so I don't have any disruptions, hopefully, in the transmission. So there we go. The next slide, please, Sean. So the survey that was earlier referenced by Arif, Morris Leatherman and Rap Strategies partnered on the survey. And we've done a lot of individualized work within school districts over the past several months. And one of the things we were learning was that there has basically been a leaning in these local surveys towards the idea that the pandemic proves that people need daily, or students need daily interaction with teachers, as opposed to we can have more and more remote learning. Well, based on this survey of the statewide audience, I think the jury's come out on this one, and they've made it pretty clear. 80% of Minnesotans agree that the pandemic demonstrates that we need daily interaction with teachers, and 54% strongly agree. I mean, we're now at the level in a survey where it's as high as the desire of people to have the Vikings win a Super Bowl at some point in our lifetimes. Only 14% agree right now that this proves we need less in-person time. Now, for all the superintendents out there, we've got a lot of data coming out of the survey, and Arif and I, along with Peter Leatherman, we'll be publishing something at the end of the month, which gives you a summary of the data on the pandemic and education. And we will share that through the service cooperatives. If you don't receive one, just in April, email either Arif or me, and we'll make sure you get that summary. But what this data shows us is that people are looking at actually making a renewed commitment to their school districts right now, to continuing the work that goes on in those buildings. And that's pretty important context to know the direction that you should be going and thinking about using investments. Next slide, Sean. So let's be honest, during a one-year pandemic where many school districts have been at hybrid or distant learning for almost the entire time, and certainly there's been a great level of uncertainty into what's going on in people's communities, we've lost some connections locally. And this provides a very unique opportunity to begin the re-engagement process as the state reopens. To begin with, you're going to be talking about priority investments. In the research that we just completed, we found that technology, health and safety, classroom flexibility, security are 4 very high priorities for investments. And most of these, you can use these dollars for. Of course, you're going to have also your own unique local needs that you can also use, but informing the public that that's your priority is going to be an important first step to getting re-engagement started. It's also a great opportunity for you to start working with community partners, we start working with parents and staff, and in fact, involving them in the prioritization discussion can re-engage them. I think the most important thing is that you probably use virtual and hybrid 500 times. And this doesn't require that. This requires you to talk about how you can improve the schools and deal with some of the issues that have emerged during the pandemic. Next slide. It's really important in your communication that you don't shorthand this. This follows a natural path that you would use for almost any plan for a new set of investments in your school district. What's your goal? What's the plan? How are you going to implement it? What are the results? Identify what the promise is and then deliver on it. And that's how you improve your credibility and your trust level in your districts. So our suggestion is that the communication starts right away with your district planning. And right away, create some clear criteria for how you want to use this money, and then have a public evaluation of it. That doesn't mean you have to go out and survey every one of your residents. It just says you need to demonstrate to the public that you're listening to them, you're giving them feedback, and that the school board is going to be transparent about this. Don't forget that the application process, the moment that you're trying to bring in the money, is also another chance to communicate well. And we would suggest that you dedicate specific space on your website, in your local newsletters, and even during school board agendas to talk about this. If you can, if you have a single theme that you can use, or maybe two themes that you can use, we would suggest that you attach that to these investments. So the community begins to understand what specifically the benefits are, not just because you explain to them in the bulleted points, but because everybody is talking about the plan in the context of those. And then finally, make sure that you use your key school audiences as communicators for you. We all know that the most trusted people in our lives are our friends and neighbors who we come in contact with every day. And you've got many of those that come in contact with the school district regularly, and you want to equip them. Last slide, Sean. Now, having said that, this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for reinvestment, and it's an opportunity for reconnection. You also need to be careful about the risks here. The first is that please remember this is one-time money. This is not going to solve all of your operating fund issues. And it's important for you to clearly communicate externally that we get this money once, we want to use it very well, but to not allow your residents to assume that this is going to solve all of the issues that may be created from an education bill from the legislature that only provides 1 or 1.5%, or your other challenges. Have a separate communications path for that. Secondly, don't let dollars get spent 3 or 4 times. And as the father of 5 kids, I know how easy it is within a family for that to happen, let alone in a school district. If you have a very clear process to identify and prioritize projects, you're going to be able to manage and focus the expectations. If you kind of make it a free-for-all in your community, it's going to be really hard when you have to make the difficult decisions of what to spend on and what you don't. And finally, you should be working doubly hard to make sure you don't have a divided school board on how this money is invested. Take the time to bring the school board into a full discussion and do whatever you can to get unanimous buy-in. Divisions about how this money can be used can foster divisions in future financial plans you have to bring out to the community. Now, I'm hopeful that most school districts understand that because this is one-time money, the board will come along with the smartest plan for how to fill the gaps that were left during the pandemic and make the investments that help the health and safety, security of buildings. But having said that, it's going to take some work, no doubt about it, in some districts to bring that board along. Good luck with this. We're going to be available, or I think Arif will talk about at the end about how you'll be able to get access to any of us if you have questions or you need advice. And as many of you know, I'm more than happy to help out when you get an opportunity like this. So thanks, Arif.
Great. Thanks a lot, Todd. So I think the final piece was, and I wanted to make sure that we keep about 15 minutes open here at the end of this to really talk about any questions all of you may have. And I know the chat function is open, so if you do have questions, just shoot it over the chat, and Sean will summarize all of those, and we'll make sure that the panel that's on here is available to answer those questions. But I also wanted to just give you a quick overview of the most recent American Society of Civil Engineering 2021 report that just came out a few weeks ago that talked about the overall 2021 infrastructure report card, right? And what was really interesting is as you start looking at this, and I hate to say this, but over the last probably decade, right, it's been school district infrastructure has always been getting kind of a D or a D plus. And I guess I told one of the guys who was responsible for the survey was, and this study was the fact, well, it is a plus, right? So it's a D plus, it's not a D, it's not an F. But we do have a challenge. And I think it's important that as you look at some of those dollars that are out there, some of the needs that you have, how do you fill that challenge as you go forward? So 2021 infrastructure report card identified that almost more than half of the schools need to upgrade the ventilation system. And I think it's really important to understand that, because as you start looking at the pandemic issue that we dealt with, you heard the old terminology in terms of, solution to pollution is dilution, but it really is in this case. We know that, when you do have a lot more fresh air coming in, a lot more outdoor air coming in, and you have a lot more air exchanges in your classroom, it's not only good for education because it makes sure that the carbon dioxide levels are a lot less, but also is really important in terms of spread of potential viruses. So I think a lot of school districts are going to have to look at, what do they need to do with the ventilation and how do they upgrade that? But at the same time, I think you have to have a balancing act, because as you bring in a lot more outdoor air, you have a lot more air exchanges, your energy costs, your operational costs go up, right? Your systems are working way harder, they may break down, and you have to really balance that out. So it's extremely important to look at not just the first cost of a lot of your projects you're looking at, but your life cycle costs. The other thing that was really interesting was 33% have capacity issues in the US. In other words, a lot of portables are still being used to make up for that capacity issue. And as you know, that's very, very challenging when you start going into a situation like this. And whether it's this pandemic or the next one that we look at that comes through, it is going to be really important that your ventilation systems, your classrooms, the way how the seating works, all that I think is going to change for the future as we move forward, and it's going to drive it. But the challenge for all of us, I think, the report identifies that annually in the infrastructure area, there's a national funding gap annually of $38 billion per year. It's significant in terms of what we need to do to continue to improve the facilities, improve the schools. Why is it important? I think the survey shows it, and I understand the survey was done in Minnesota, but you start looking at the survey in some of these other states that we're hopefully going to start doing, I think you're going to find it's very homogeneous. I think the people are going to look at this and say schools are extremely important. In-class education is very important, but there's current state gaps, and this was identified right in the ASCE report. There's a state gap in Minnesota of about $818 million per year. Pennsylvania is close to 1.4 billion, and then North Dakota 162, South Dakota 125, and Iowa 500 million. So this is an important piece when you start looking at your own facilities and the fact that there's going to be even more demand for those facilities. And I think there'll be even more space challenges when you start looking at how those classrooms will be set up, and potential operational dollar issues too. Because when you start looking at the distancing that you're going to have, the filtration you're going to need, all those kind of things, it is important to look at these and say, okay, what is the plan? Is it make sense to make some minor investments, at least with some of those dollars, into our facilities as we move forward? Next. So really talking about our next steps, right? As I told you, we don't have all the answers at this point, but we're spending a lot of time pulling a lot of data and information together. And we've kind of set up a program team. So if we go to the next slide, this really identifies, we've created a program office around the stimulus dollars. And it's not just related to the rescue plan. It's also related to what Blake talked about, is there's going to be significant infrastructure dollars that will potentially flow through. If I'm correct right now, Blake, is it about 100 billion or so potentially for K-12? Of course, it's going to change, but.
Yeah, and it could change throughout that legislative process. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell threw some cold water on kind of the discussions yesterday, which may ultimately change the shape and size of the package. But as currently envisioned by House Democrats, it would be about $100 billion for school construction and upgrades in the next infrastructure package.
Okay, so I think there's some additional dollars in the infrastructure package coming in. So I think this is an ever evolving field. So we've developed basically a program office. And as you can see, we brought in some of our federal stimulus consultants, legislative expert, infrastructure experts, communication, and procurement too. Because when you start going into the future procurement issues you're going to run into, there are some clauses in that in terms of Buy America clause and some of the paperwork that ends up going very similar to, I think, what we had in 2009. Right after that issue in terms of ARRA and how those projects and how the equipment should be procured. So the other thing we've also done is created an email hotline and a phone number, and also a website that you can go to. So you'll see at the bottom, and I'll make sure that if some of you want this PowerPoint, I'll make sure we get it out to all of you. But the email is here, stimulus@ics-builds.com. You have the hotline phone number, 651-728-1880, and you'll see the website. The intent of this is we want to kind of centralize the communication so that if you have any questions, you can go on our website. There's a form you can complete and ask the key questions. It'll be our job to get it to this program office, identify the answer, and our hope is, within 24 hours, we'll be able to get the answers to you as we move forward. So again, we're making some investments in that, but I think this will be very valuable as we move forward. So the upcoming webinar topics, right? There's a lot going on. We need to fully understand how the funds are going to flow. We need to make sure and help you guys to make sure that your planning is set up correctly, and then how you leverage those funds for the multiplier effect and a timeline of expenditures. So I think these are all the things that you're going to start noticing, and we'll kind of have to make a decision if this, depending on how fast things are changing on the ground, whether we do this, every 2 weeks or every month. We'll kind of sit down as a program office and make some determination. But really the intent of this is to have an ongoing session, bring in the experts, bring in the people that are really fully engaged and involved with this stimulus dollars, and provide some additional communication and support for all of you. Okay. With that, what I'd like to do is, I know that we've got about 13 minutes left here. So if any of you have any questions and so forth, make sure that we will try to get those answered. I know there was a question here, and I'll ask this question to Blake. I think, what about charter schools? Can some of this funding be also used for charter schools?
Yes, charter schools will be included in the formula funding to the schools.
Okay, and does that fall under the public in that 125 billion, I'm assuming, or? Okay. Sean, are there any other questions on the chat?
Yeah, is there a time frame that funding needs to be spent by?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sean, and I appreciate that. I think, there's a couple different deadlines that are written into the bill. There's also a little bit of fluid kind of general parameters that are included to provide folks on the ground with the maximum flexibility. Things included that have a specific deadline are things like September 6th. All of the unemployment insurance benefits need to be spent out because that's how far it's authorized through. There's also general parameters around funds that need to be spent before the end of fiscal year 2022. So that's probably kind of the biggest macro one. There's some specifics around that need to be spent within the first 12 months that a state receives it. Once those states receive it, they're going to put together that regulatory guidance that then kind of dictates what their timeline looks like. So some of those specific deadlines will come to light, but there's obviously some built into the bill that are very specific to programs that are authorized through a specific function.
We just had another one come in. Can this funding be used to replace RTUs?
Yep, I can answer that. So yes, I think that you can use this to improve your ventilation. So any rooftop units that you have, any ventilation that's not meeting at a minimum the ASHRAE requirements for acceptable indoor air quality, those funds can be used for that. I think I just caution everybody that when you use those dollars for some of those things, you're also going to have an impact in terms of your energy consumption and your operating costs. So you just want to look at and make decisions based on a life cycle basis and not just the first cost basis. There are some requirements for that dollars, though, Blake, that about 20% has to be used for some specific items, correct?
Correct.
So there is some specific guidelines, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail as we get a better understanding of how they may ask school districts to use those dollars. But at this point, specifically, it identifies that these dollars can be used for anything associated with reopening schools after the pandemic, and ventilation is clearly a component of it. It actually highlights ventilation as one of the areas that you should be spending dollars to make improvements. There's a lot of studies, actually recently research studies that have been done that clearly show that as you improve ventilation, the risk of transmission goes down exponentially. So absolutely can be used for that. Okay, any other questions, Sean?
I have not seen any come through. Oh, we just
Yep,
Had
there's
one.
one question here. My understanding is funds can be used to build and repurpose space for social distancing. As a 6-foot spacing is being reduced to lower distances, you see this use of funds also changing. So I think that's a really good question, right? I mean, there's some discussion out there that maybe we don't need the 6-foot distancing. So can you use those dollars for that? Yes, you can. We can use those dollars for that. I would again caution everyone that when you're looking at making investments in your facilities, and especially if you're looking at classroom changes, which will also have a big impact on the structural side and the ventilation, that again, plan it carefully and understand what the most current data is coming out. But you're absolutely right. CDC is actually doing some analysis right now to determine if 6 feet is the right distance. They've looked at 4 feet, they've looked at 3 feet. So that'll continue to change as we go forward.
Can we get an estimate by school district from you?
Yeah, we can provide that. So if anybody's looking at what the estimates are for, I'm assuming, Lane, that's for actually the phase 3 funding that is coming in. Yep, we have the spreadsheet that we've been able to calculate for that. I just caution that it's based on the tier 1 formula, but I'm assuming that that is going to remain, and that's not going to necessarily change because I think it specifically lays that out in the legislation. So yes, we have those calculations done by district, and just shoot us an email at stimulus@ics-bills.com, and we'll make sure we get your data and your information over for your district.
One thing, Arif, I would just put a finer point on the issue of kind of social distancing and the use of these funds. The congressional intent with the legislation is to safely reopen and keep schools open. And so I would encourage folks, as you figure out what is required, not only to open your schools, but to keep it open over the long term, what are those things that you're going to need in place? And what are those things that you're going to want to, potentially invest in now? There is, as I mentioned, this second infrastructure package that's slowly working its way through Congress that has, larger kind of infrastructure type of things like, school construction, rural broadband, a whole host of things that really kind of, you think of the kind of the brick and mortar type of things. But intended in this legislation is the flexibility for schools to make specific changes to their school to not only to open it, but to keep it open. And the idea is to keep it open as long as possible, given the ongoing pandemic. And so there will be opportunities to tap into some of those resources to provide for that purpose as well.
And then we had another one come in. What is the time frame this money has to be used by?
Yeah, it's a great question. Just to reinforce, I think part of it, we're waiting for some regulatory guidance from the state, as well as some of the other entities that the money will be flowing through. The intent of Congress is to get the money out as quickly as possible. There are some specific deadlines in the legislation. I would say the one that you want to work toward is anywhere between 12 months and the end of fiscal year 2022. Those are kind of the broadest guidelines. That being said, once the state is in recipient of the money and sends it out to the school districts, included in there will be some additional timelines and some guidance on when they would like to see the money spent by. But ultimately, the goal is to reopen schools and to get kids back in classrooms. And so the intent is to get money out as quickly as possible. So as you think through planning, I would probably say it's a wise use of resources to think on the earlier end than something a little bit further on. The flexibility is in the legislation to allow folks to use it as is needed on the ground for those things to reopen. I would simply caution that things that need to happen way down the road will be a little bit harder to justify of things that need to happen in order to reopen the school today. And so I would be, as you plan through those things, think through kind of what are those things that need to happen right away.
So what's to prevent a school district from using the money for property tax relief?
Another great question. In the ever-evolving nature of this business, yesterday, 21 state attorneys general filed suit against the legislation, saying that it preempted schools from acting on tax relief. That is going to be a matter for the courts coming up here soon. As I try to lay a little bit of the political context here, this was passed on party line vote that upset Republicans. It has historically been something that received bipartisan support. So now that it kind of goes from passing Congress and now into the implementation stage, there will be some issues within the court and some litigation that is being filed against the legislation. to deal with how schools can use the funding, specifically as it relates to the control over local and state taxes.
So just, I understand though, right, the overall reason for providing those dollars was for reopening schools and to keep them open. I'm just curious how that fits into property tax relief, because that wouldn't really impact that specific outcome.
Yeah, so the idea here was to make sure that, you know, any influx of funding that came in wasn't then used to offset reducing tax burden on folks on the ground, because it kind of defeats the purpose of what the need for the infusion was to begin with. So there was a provision in there that specifically said that it's Congress's intent that this can't be then used to offset any, you know, operating deficits or anything that dealt with the way in which the local tax structure is done. That's why the 21 attorneys general yesterday filed suit against it, saying that it basically takes away that the freedom of folks on the ground to set their own taxes, and that Congress is, you know, trying to preemptively tell the state and local folks what to do. You know, eventually this is going to become a constitutional question for the courts to weigh in on, but it's certainly something that is it is a tactic and a tool that's currently being implemented to try to slow down the implementation of the legislation.
Great, thanks, Blake.